Oil prices easing this morning as investors monitor escalating attacks between Iran and Israel. So far, strikes have spared critical infrastructure and the vital Strait of Hormuz remains open. With more on what this backdrop could mean for U.S. policy, we've got Henrietta Treyz, who's the Veda Partners managing director and managing partner and director of economic policy here. You're very important, and we want to make sure that we got the titles correct here. Henrietta, great to see you once again. Just take us into the significance of the events that have escalated over the weekend and your best anticipations for what we should be watching for next from this point.
Thanks for having me, Brad. My job is to translate how global events impact legislation in Capitol Hill and how that impacts investors. So first and foremost, the sanctions bill that senators had been very hopeful they'd be able to move sometime in the next couple of days is very much, I think, not on the table anymore. The White House has always pushed back on it pretty substantially, but the goal is to tie the president's hands and force him to take a tougher tone with Vladimir Putin. That's plainly not going to be something that they prioritize now, given Israel's actions in Iran, and as evidenced by the fact that the first person Trump called was Vladimir Putin to have him negotiate some sort of peace between Israel and Iran, which is going to be the topic of G7 discussions in Canada throughout this week. The second layer impact is that senators are going to deflect away from, say, deploying the National Guard and the Marines into California and away from the crackdown on mass deportations and the negative blowback that's had for the labor sector, specifically restaurants and farm workers, and try to get to the tax bill. So the tax package is on deck for this week. The senators are going to roll out their tax portion tonight at around 6 p.m., and that's where they'll train the next 3 days of their focus. They're only in session for 3 days, so they can't do too much damage.
And so with that in mind, what is the reality that as we're evaluating all of these moving parts on separate fronts and in separate regions, where do you think the priority for the administration is placing the focus right now?
It's really hard to say. I mean, there's so much going on. I think they are already deploying replenishing tankers and other aircraft out to Israel and going across the Atlantic right now. So they're plainly keeping an eye on that, prepared to jump in if necessary. But I think they really need to be worried about the market. Y'all were talking about the tariffs and corporate earnings coming up. Only 10% of corporations have updated their guidance based on the tariffs. So there's going to be a massive recalibration, I'm anticipating, as these tariffs both stay in effect and rise more than most people are anticipating. That's going to be sector specific with new Section 232 tariffs coming down the pike, as well as nation specific as we head into Liberation Day 2.0, as I'm calling it, or July 9th. Some countries are going to see their tariff rates rise. And that's going to be something that the market has to adjust to because that's not currently priced in.
With that in mind, as we were taking a look at some fresh news this morning, it sounds like the EU could be weighing a 10% deal on the tariff front with that deadline in focus here. What is the probability that you believe that becomes reality as now this deadline is all the more closer and many countries are trying to figure out if they will really get a pause extension if they're shown to be negotiating in good faith, as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had just said last week?
Yeah, I think what we need to get used to, and this is what I told clients last week, is these tariffs are not coming off. So you might see a reduction in some rates. For example, Mexico is going to see the 50% tariff on steel and aluminum potentially go to 25% for certain above quota items. But with the EU, my fear has been that the EU tariffs will go into effect at their full 20% Liberation Day rate instead of staying at the 10% threshold. And if the best that they can anticipate and what constitutes a win to the EU is maintaining 10% tariffs, that is a permanent go-forward hit. And the reason I say the tariffs are going to rise is because that does not account for the Section 232 tariffs on steel, the other ones coming on lumber, copper, uranium, and a whole host of other items, including semiconductors, that are still coming down the pike before we even get into the Section 899 revenge tax and the new monetary policy authority granted to the Treasury Secretary on Ireland and Switzerland. So more tariffs, more taxes are coming.
You know, you mentioned steel, and of course, we can't have this conversation without talking about what was seen as one of the potential kind of pawns, or at least game pieces, within the broader deal-making moves here that we're seeing on the geopolitical front, and that is between Nippon Steel and, of course, the acquisition that was moving forward here between the U.S. Steel Corporation and Nippon Steel. The significance of that moving forward and this golden share from your evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about trying to generate headlines that appear as though there is domestic investment, regardless of what the president said on the campaign trail. Obviously, this is a complete about face. And authorizing this merger or acquisition to go into effect is something that I think the Steel Workers Union has been of mixed, at least public expression about, because they know they needed the investment. And Pittsburgh needs the investment. The entire state of Pennsylvania needs the investment. So that's what's coming. But it optically was such a problem during the campaign that you had to present as though you didn't support it. So now that that's moving forward, I think is in line with a lot of analysts' expectation.
Henrietta, always a great pleasure to get some of your insights on a range of topics here this morning. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.